just throughout the semester, some really groundbreaking and interesting books in showing us, a lot of them, of course, dealt with the war in Ukraine, but we've seen certain points of view of the war, which has been really interesting, various points of view. So I think we'll have that as well today. The name of the book is By the Second Spring, 7 Lives and 1 Year of the War in Ukraine. And the author of the book is with us right here, is Danielle Leavitt. Welcome to Harriman Institute. Danielle holds a PhD in history from Harvard University. She has been a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. In fall 2025, Danielle will be a postdoctoral fellow and instructor at the University of Michigan's Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. She is currently working on a second book entitled When the New Soviet Man Grew Old: Generation, Gerontocracy, and the Aging of Socialism. By the Second Spring is her first book. She lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So Danielle will give her presentations and we'll get a chance to ask some questions about the book and about things we talked about. So welcome. I'll probably move over there.
Great,
Get away.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
It's such a pleasure to be here and among such a distinguished crowd. I'm really grateful for the invitation to speak today about my book, and I'll pass this around. I just got my author's copies last week, hot off the press. The book will be published May 20th. So it's available for pre-order now, and I'm so pleased. This is my first stop on my book tour, and you're my first real live audience to talk about this book, and I'm thrilled to share it with you. I'll begin with a diary entry. It's written by a woman named Yulia. When I first read it, it kept me awake on the other side of the world. April 8th, 2022, quote, I heard a whistle above my head. I managed to look into the sky, realizing that it was the sound of an approaching projectile. Not knowing where to hide, I decided to move under a grove of pine trees. And then there was an explosion. Like the sound of a whip, only multiplied 100 times. I was pushed by an explosive wave in the back and hit in my legs. I fell face down on a bench where 2 elderly women were sitting. One of them was wounded in the head, and her blood splashed on my face. We managed to look in each other's eyes. We were both horrified. I tried to crawl a little lower, covering my head with my hands, already realizing there was a problem with my legs. Yulia went on, quote, there was dead silence for a few seconds. I tried to sit up and saw that my legs were broken into kasha, porridge. I saw my bones and yellow marrow mixed with meat and blood. I tried to shout help. I wanted to ask for a scarf or something with which to tie my legs and stop at least minimally the bleeding. But I realized that there is no one to help. Raising my head a little, I saw that the people standing and sitting opposite me were also covered in blood. Everyone who was near the volunteer tea stand was dead. Then a terrible howling began, the screaming of those who saw their loved ones dead and wounded. Remembering this sound, she wrote, is harder than experiencing the physical pain. After reading her account for the first time, I could not shake it off. I felt physically ill, like I needed to throw up. I kept rereading it again and again. It was as though 10,000 miles away, I could hear this woman's voice as though she were in the room with me. It was this entry that led me to write this book and why I'm here with you today. What happened is this. A couple of months into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, my parents, who have worked in Ukraine on and off since the early 2000s, helped administer a humanitarian aid project, the goal of which was to provide financial aid to several hundred Ukrainian families who were displaced. As part of that project, they also created an online space for Ukrainians to record their experiences in the form of a diary, if they wished, as they lived through war. So people in the rest of the world could hear their voices and better understand what they were going through. Many of them took this opportunity very enthusiastically. They were motivated to write and share their experiences. And after a couple of months, there were hundreds of entries. In the summer of 2022, I had just had a baby. And so I spent a lot of time awake in the night. And one night I began reading these entries. The diaries took me by surprise. They were staggering and personal and unguarded and insightful. There were so many different stories and people, so many different profiles and details. And an old man, for example, who had cared for his disabled mother for 40 years, who ditched her wheelchair at the banks of a river and carried her across the river when they were forced to evacuate on foot. Or a woman and her husband who were evacuated from their small town in the large water tank of a fire truck. And of course, countless dreadful witnesses of destruction and death, as in the case of Yulia's account. As I read diaries like Yulia's and watched them evolve over time, I began to sense with increasing fervor that these stories really mattered, that they were essential to understanding the war itself. In time, as I read, I knew that others too needed to hear these voices. And in their words was a chance to really influence how those unfamiliar with Ukraine and its people might understand this war. I knew I needed to write this book. I contacted a few of the diarists and asked if I could interview them and follow them in real time for many months to better understand the realities of their lives. They all agreed. In fact, to my surprise, many more agreed than I could feasibly interview. In the end, Yulia and 6 other people allowed me to correspond with them consistently throughout the first and second years of this war. What emerged from those conversations is this book, By the Second Spring, which is a story that delves far beyond the headlines. It's an intimate portrait of the lives of 7 ordinary people caught up in the most extraordinary circumstances. We follow these 7 people through the first year and a half of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And through that, we get a chance to really see what it looks like and feels like to live daily in a cruel, unwanted, and prolonged modern war. By learning about their personal histories, their childhoods, their families, and their towns, We're also untangling the deeper historical threads between Ukraine and Russia, going back to the Soviet Union and beyond. By the Second Spring aimed to shed light on the story of Ukraine's distinct origins, its people, language, and culture, a story that over the centuries and spilling into today has been at turns suppressed and distorted. With that, it's absolutely imperative that American audiences and people around the world gain a deeper understanding of what we're witnessing today. It's the most important and serious way to be able to discern and contextualize the events of this war. On my end, this involved exchanging thousands of messages, voice recordings, videos, photos. My phone buzzed at all hours. As the time zone required, I was often up in the middle of the night to correspond with my interlocutors. For me, the responsibility of telling their stories right weighed very heavily. And my subjects introduced me to their family and friends so that I could further flesh out their stories fairly. So why do we need a book like this about this war? What gap does it fill? Up to now, there has been some incredible long-form reporting and analysis, but never quite a chronicle like this, which follows multiple people of diverse origins across Ukraine for an extended period of time. This is ultimately the first ever book of its kind on this war. And what it does is bring forward voices and experiences of people who have largely been invisible. So much media coverage from the very first hours of this war was devoted to shifting front lines and the movement of displaced people. But it was clear that this is about so much more than tanks and territories lost or gained. The fact is, you cannot understand this war if you do not understand what's going on with the average people experiencing it. The people who are living through the impact of the biggest land war in Europe in 75 years. By the end of my talk, my hope is that you'll understand how urgent and how significant it is that you, the audience, the reader, the listener, have a richer, more complex, more human understanding of this war, one that allows you a fuller capacity to read into the daily headlines and beyond them to something broader, deeper, more truthful, and more human. History has been wielded consistently as one of the main ideological weapons in this war. And one of the persistent global obstacles facing Ukraine is that its history is usually one of three things: confusing, unknown, or Russified. Because of this, the Ukrainian past and questions like which territory rightfully belongs to Ukraine and are Ukrainians really just Russians are conundrums that most American readers, even the relatively well-informed, struggle to decipher. Following these 7 individuals through war gave me a chance to explore the history of their families and the events that touched them. For example, I show how Ukraine has been shaped by a continuous struggle for cultural and political survival under foreign domination, and how Ukraine has been divided by imperial forces and then violently reunited. Persecution, exile, war, and hunger are defining traumas in Ukrainian history, and I explore those through the family histories of the people in my book. I'm attempting to bring forward a fair, nuanced, and rigorous history of Ukraine that is tethered to the lives of 7 real people, with the hope that this approach helps American readers understand and remember a very complex history and care about it, and come away from the book knowing that Ukraine is its own country, distinct from Russia, and has a right to exist as such. One person I followed in my book that allowed me to explore, for example, the 1990s and the development of Ukrainian national identity was a middle-aged man named Vitaly, who lived his whole life in Borodyanka, 30 miles northwest of Kyiv. Here's Vitaly. You can see him standing on a pile of rubble in his hometown, with the Banksy graffiti behind him that emerged in the first year of war. He came of age in the post-Soviet 1990s. And in those years, with the arrival of McDonald's and Nirvana and acid wash jeans, the West became synonymous with cool. Despite job insecurity and catastrophic inflation, he and most young people of his generation rejected the ideologies of the Soviet past in favor of the rickety, dysfunctional market capitalism taking root. New coffee shops, bars, and pizzerias proliferated. And as a young man in the 1990s, Vitaly developed 2 dreams: to own his own coffee shop and to someday see the Statue of Liberty. Half of Vitaly's wardrobe seemed to reference America. The photos he uploaded to his diary showed him standing on the banks of a river wearing shorts emblazoned with the American flag, a shirt with an NBA star superimposed onto the New York City skyline, a Yankees hat, and flip-flops. He exuded a distinctive Eastern European machismo. And in photos, he posed with a serious, unflinching expression, not happy, not sad, unquestionably alpha. And yet, at moments, a tenderness peeked through. The more I came to know Vitaly in his writing, I learned that he loved to draw. He sometimes recited poetry, and he wore his heart on his sleeve, pining on occasion for a woman named Natalka, who was his close friend and first love, who had moved with her children to the United States in 2015. When Natalka moved to New York City, he decided he wasn't going to wait anymore. He would save all his money and open his coffee shop. And in time, he'd make enough money to buy a ticket to the Big Apple and see the Statue of Liberty. I was endeared to Vitaly the first time I read his accounts. He could be gruff on occasion, but he liked to joke. He seems to represent so many Ukrainian men who I've known throughout my life. And as we corresponded, he described how hard he had worked for his coffee shop. He is naturally scrappy and prone to buck authority. He was made for 1990s Ukraine, where those with aggressive spirits had to figure out how to survive and make the new system work in their favor. During those years, he served his mandatory time in the Ukrainian army. He worked in construction as a welder and for several years in a sawmill. But in the early 2000s, he wanted to try to work for himself, be his own man. He didn't have any money to start anything, so he began collecting trash to sell, scavenging through old buildings and junkyards, taking broken plastic from window frames, rusted out elevator parts, stairway railings from abandoned buildings. He broke the garbage down into different piles, one for hard plastic, one for metal, one for softer plastic, like packaging and plastic bottles, and one for paper. There was a lot of paper, as people were throwing away Soviet books and manuals that had lost all relevance. Vitaly was 16 when the USSR collapsed. His identity as a Ukrainian was still embryonic, as it was for most Ukrainians, but he knew somehow deep down that he was not Russian. As a first grader, he held sticks between his knees and pretended to be a Zaporizhian Cossack. It was not something that anyone taught him to do, and he doesn't know where he learned it, but it reinforced a vague sense of apartness. He grew up speaking Russian, although he often spoke Ukrainian with his mom and grandma. But even as a teenage boy with a limited understanding of politics, breaking with the Soviet Union was something he supported, especially following the nuclear disaster at Chernobyl in 1986 when he was 11 years old. He remembered busloads of evacuated people flooding his town, which was about 60 miles from the exploded reactor, arriving in the middle of the night in late April. Many of them settled in Borodyanka, and he grew up understanding that something dark had occurred at Chernobyl, that his friends would never return home because the area was contaminated. It was all dead. As time went on, the environmental impact of the Chernobyl disaster became clearer, and he suspects that his body absorbed it too, as millions did. By the time he was 40 years old, most of his teeth had fallen out. Over time, as he collected garbage to recycle and salvaged old materials, he was not just surviving, but saving money. And by late 2021, it was finally time for his coffee shop. He rented a modest commercial space on the roundabout entrance to Borodyanka from Kyiv, right next to his apartment building and courtyard. He budgeted and saved to get all of the necessary appliances, a grill, a microwave, a refrigerator, a small electric oven. But most of all, he coveted a professional grade espresso machine, like the ones he imagined baristas in New York City using in bustling cafes. Renting the machine would have been more fiscally responsible, but he allowed himself this one luxury after so many years of meticulous planning and saving. Although he was not much of a reader, Vitaly pored over the machine's instructional manual, meditating upon each of its features. He ordered frozen dough for baked goods from suppliers, because as Vitaly says, what is a coffee shop without freshly baked croissants? His girlfriend sewed curtains and decorated the shop with fake flowers and coffee-themed wooden signs. And he called the shop Coffee Break and on February 1st, 2022, they opened to the public right on the highway E373, the same highway that a few weeks later, a long convoy of Russian tanks would travel on their way to Kyiv. He wrote in his diary, quote, "We didn't even immediately understand what was going on. Maybe we should have saved the equipment, the purchased goods, but we acted exactly the opposite. On February 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, and even on February 28th, I still went to work, to my coffee shop. Of course, we hid in the basements when columns of enemy equipment passed by us. But as soon as they passed, we immediately opened the blinds and again began to distribute coffee, tea, chocolate bars, and pastries. And even when a Russian tank drove into the store opposite us just to destroy it, we did not get scared and did not panic, but continued our work. But then the real hell began. When I first read Vitaly's story, I could not stop wondering, what kind of man goes to work at the coffee shop on the first day of war? And then on the second and the third, even when the city is being invaded. He told me that as this was all happening, he was doing a back flush of the espresso machine to keep it in good condition. To understand a man like Vitaly, a man who is cleaning his coffee machine as tanks roll into the building across the street, you have to understand just how far back his dream goes. He is telling us what this coffee shop means to him on the first day of war. The history of Ukraine is not simply a set of stories that's useful context. It is the ground on which these people now stand, and it brings us to today. For Vitaly, the history of the USSR, the Chernobyl disaster, the 1990s, the protests and political upheaval of the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity, all of it contributed to this framework that he employed when he dreamed the dreams that he had for his life. When his coffee shop was destroyed, along with his home, most of his town, and many of his friends and loved ones, Vitaly lost more than a home and a career. He lost a sense of self, a sense of identity and purpose. He was unmoored, and he veered on unhinged. When Borodyanka was liberated, he was back there immediately, the very next day, and spent much of those first months turning over rubble to look for items that had been preserved, items that he might salvage to prove to himself that there was still some future left in that place and in that past. After several weeks of digging, he found something familiar: his espresso machine. Many things surprised me as I wrote this book. Many stories and details moved me deeply. I often cried as I wrote, but nothing surprised me or moved me more than witnessing what I saw in each of my subjects, which is that human beings possess an astonishing ability to respond with remarkable resilience and agency in the face of uncertainty and brutality. As I corresponded for many months with these 7 individuals and their families, they confronted unimaginable violence and precarity. In this time, many of them lost much of what was dear to them. Their families were separated, their homes were destroyed, their towns were overtaken, their bodies injured. This is Yulia, the woman whose story opened my talk. Yulia was rushed to the small local hospital in Kramatorsk, the town where the missile attack had occurred at the local train station. When they arrived at the hospital, the corridors were filled with the wounded. 60 people were killed at the Kramatorsk railway station and more than 100 injured. They lined the hallways and many lay in the middle of the floor directly on the tiles. She underwent a hasty surgery to manage her bleeding before she was rushed to a larger hospital in Dnipro. One of her legs was fully amputated. The other was severely marred. She lost a finger as well, and only 2 weeks after the attack did she even find out that she had a wound the size of 2 palms on the back of her thigh. She spent months in the hospital, and after she was released, she suffered extraordinarily in body, in mind, and spirit. And yet, in general, Yulia has been able to manage her emotional and psychological distress remarkably well. Antidepressants helped her immensely, as did her calm and gentle nature. While she didn't shy away from talking about difficult topics, she regularly said things like, quote, "The most important thing in such difficult situations is not to give in to despair." Or, quote, "You can choose the passive oppression of your body and soul, or you can work on yourself, correct your body and thoughts from negative to positive. I allow myself to cry sometimes, but not for long." Of all my interlocutors, Yulia wanted to know the most about me. She asked me often about myself, my opinions, my daily life. I could tell she grew tired of talking about war, and she often changed the subject to other aspects of life she enjoyed: parenting, crafting, home decorating, gardening. I often sent her photos and videos of my children. We both have 2 daughters. Hers were grown up and mine little, and she loved to revel in my photos and videos. Once she gave me advice on how to keep them from drawing all over our apartment walls. And we engaged in a conversation for several days about the hazards and delights of toddlers until it suddenly stopped. She went silent for some time, though I could see that she had seen my messages. When she returned to our conversation after several days, we didn't talk about children drawing on walls or jumping on furniture. Her small town was being shelled again, which was no longer news in itself, but this time the activity was so near their home that all the windows in their house were shattered, and one of their animals had been killed by a shell fragment. A week or so later, Yulia wanted to talk about other things again, but hanging over our conversation was the understanding that we lived in different worlds, that she had been touched by war and I had not. Once she mentioned to me that in their town, just a few kilometers from the center of the front line's carnage, some people still sold pumpkins from their gardens at an outdoor market. When a building on the market street was shelled, those farmers helped to clean up the mess and then went back to work. When the market itself was shelled, they found a new place to sell their pumpkins. Despite the danger, they tried to live an ordinary life, and I sensed that this is what she did in our conversations too. Yulia represents a key truth in this war, which is that behind every headline, are tens of millions of Ukrainians who, like Yulia and Vitaly, are the people who have been living through and waging the war we speak of, enduring its unrelenting precarity and grappling with catastrophes as they arise daily and randomly. And they have demonstrated that so many of them possess an astonishing ability to respond with resilience in the face of brutality and uncertainty. They are not giving up on their bodies, their people, their dreams, and their country. And we must not give up on them either. When we witness Ukrainians like Yulia and Vitaly refusing to surrender their dignity, their dreams, and their humanity, even in the face of devastation, we are not just witnessing a fight for their survival. We are witnessing a defense of the very ideas that bind all free people together: the right to live, to hope, to build, to belong. Their resilience demands more from us than admiration. It asks for solidarity. It asks that we listen, even when we are overwhelmed ourselves, that we remember, that we stand with them, not just for Ukraine's future, but for the future of a world where truth matters, where freedom matters, and where ordinary people, in both their vulnerability and in their strength, are never forgotten. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Thank you for finding yet another way for keeping people listening. In such a profound way of doing this by focusing on, you see ordinary people, average people, which obviously they're extraordinary, right? And these stories that you tell and the way you tell them is quite beautiful and powerful. So thank you for doing that. I'm opening up the floor for questions, so think of some questions as I warm up here. I hope you have some. My question to you is, you didn't talk that much about your own history, right? Well, what's your connection to Ukraine? But we talked a little bit beforehand. Some people may know that you lived in Ukraine, grew up in Ukraine for a while. My question to you is, having lived in Ukraine before the war, right? And then becoming involved, reading these diaries. I know you learned something. What did you learn from the diaries that you didn't learn while living in Ukraine? Were there things when you lived in Ukraine that maybe they were there and that reading these diaries brought out, or were these things that were completely different? What was it that did that? I know it's hard to describe because you're talking about age also and you developing this person, but you know what I mean? Was there something that was there having lived in Ukraine for a while that was brought out, or these were completely new? You were seeing completely different things when reading these diaries?
It's a really good question. It was part of what made the diaries so immediately compelling to me was that they felt so familiar, that I could see Ukrainians so clearly in them, people that I knew really well. I could, hear their voices, the phrases that they used, the places that they referenced, the food that they were eating, all of that stuff. That's initially what drew me in, is that it felt so familiar. What shocked me the more that I kept reading is that, the last time that I was in Ukraine before the full-scale invasion was August of 2021. So 6 months before the full-scale invasion. What shocked me as I continued reading was how they were suddenly living in a different Ukraine than I had ever seen. And I was there 6 months earlier, and suddenly they were experiencing a different country than I had ever seen. So even though I was drawn in initially by the familiarity, I think I kept reading because I was so perplexed by how dramatically this, how this society was living through something so dramatic and so traumatic that, you know,
Yeah.
it was so foreign to me suddenly.
So the familiarity with topography, with place names, with daily lives, with how streets looked, how people talk, the
Yeah.
fact that it was different now made it even more shocking.
Yeah, that
Because it was familiar.
they're talking about bombs
Right,
on
right.
these streets, or, you know, air raids, death, war, soldiers, things that were so unfamiliar to me, in this place that I felt, you know, so much kinship, you know, these people that I felt so much kinship with, feel so much kinship with. One moment, perhaps just to really drive this home, one moment that really, I guess, solidified that feeling for me is my parents have an apartment in Kyiv where I lived for many years and partially, you know, grew up. And in the early months of the war, they allowed international Legion, Foreign Legion soldiers to stay in the apartment while they were transferring between different posts or whatever. I was kind of like open to different Foreign Legion soldiers. And I had been staying in this apartment with my family. 6 months earlier, I was completing PhD research in Kyiv, and was there with my toddler daughter. My husband had been working there all summer, and had pictures of my daughter, pictures and videos of my daughter like dancing on the coffee table with her, like her toys and books strewn out all over the coffee table. And I received a photo at some point in March or April of 2022 of guns on the coffee table and ammunition on the coffee table. And I was so shaken by the juxtaposition of these two worlds, that, you know, the familiar and the foreign.
Contrast there. Yeah. Thank you very much for your answer. Yes, a question here and then here.
I guess it's kind of related to that point. I mean, I'm interested in, I guess the experience over time and sort of, you know, we know, you know, in the post-Soviet period since 2014 and maybe even more since 2022, that sort of public opinion on issues like national identity in Ukraine has changed very rapidly. And then we have these surveys who can see it very clearly kind of sociologically. I'm wondering, and this kind of came up when you talked about Vitaly, sort of from a personal perspective, from the perspective that you bring. I mean, how do those very sort of stark transformations in Ukrainian society that we see play out in, you know, ordinary people's lives?
That's such a good question. That's really one of the big things that I'm trying to grapple with in my book, is these ordinary people who are undergoing, you know, radical ideological shifts during the war. You know, I have a young mother from Mariupol who is displaced and living in Western Ukraine, and she talked with me a lot about the experience of transitioning to being exclusively Ukrainian speaking and how kind of psychologically challenging that was for her. Or Yulia, who is from the Donbass and actually of Russian heritage, has lived in Ukraine her family's lived in Ukraine for 2 generations, and how dramatically her relationship to her heritage has shifted, or you know, it. And I guess one of the things that's been interesting for me to see is that there are many paths that people are taking in this transformation. You know, some are quite militant, some are quite relaxed, and everywhere in between. And it's been really interesting to see how people use these ideological transformations as a way of coping. That's probably one of the biggest themes in the book. And I'm not sure that my answer really addressed your question, but if you read the book, I promise it will.
Thank you so much for this, Danielle. I have a question. I'm a little almost scared to hear the answer, but I really want to hear it, and a very honest one. I mean, in my mind, you are like the perfect person to write this book. You have this personal experience in Ukraine. You have this, this rigorous training in Ukrainian history. From Sidney Poki, like one of the leaders in the field of Ukrainian history at Harvard in particular. It seems like your background as an historian is such an asset to this project, but I also imagine that there are certain things about your skill set as a historian, which I don't want to say like weren't relevant, but they just like didn't really apply and maybe even limited you as meaning like, or were not easily accessible or useful, perhaps to engage in this different project than a work of obviously academic history. So I'm wondering, like, in what ways do you feel like your historian's toolkit was useful? In what ways was it maybe like a hindrance, or in what ways was it just like
That's such a good question.
nothing at all?
Yeah, that is such a good question. I first began reading these diaries in the summer of 2022. And for those of you who are PhD students or at one point were PhD students, I was just entering my final year of my PhD program that summer. I was on my completion fellowship. And so I had like a lot of dissertation writing still to do. And I began reading these diaries, and for my dissertation, I was, like neck deep in Ukrainian Soviet sources and sources, from Russia and, whatever, all eras of the Soviet Union. And as I read the diaries, I was like, I know how to read these sources. I am so, this is so entrenched right now for me as I finish my dissertation. And that's part of what motivated me initially, is that I began reading the diaries kind of as I toggled back and forth between the diaries and the sources for my dissertation. And I was like, I know how to read these sources. I've been trained to do this. I can contextualize them. I get how this works. And so I began pursuing writing this. Like I said, I was so compelled. I've never been compelled to do something more than I was to write this book. I just like knew I had to do it. And so I finished the dissertation, began, proposals for this book, and eventually signed with a publisher. I signed with a publisher the week after I defended my dissertation, and immediately like shifting away from this hardcore historiographical work into a work like this was quite a pivot, because it was clear to me, I'm not making a historiographical argument here, and I'm not contributing to any sort of big literature, and I'm not actually making interventions in what other people have said, or it's just like a different frame of mind. But in other ways, it was such a relief for me to leave behind that kind of writing and be able to focus exclusively on being as true as I knew how to the stories that these people were telling me. And it gave me a lot of creative freedom. I felt relieved to have that sort of creative freedom, that I wasn't bound to, some sort of like methodological norm. And as I was writing the history of Ukraine in the book, vis-a-vis the stories, the personal stories of my subjects, I found that my training was invaluable. I understood very well the debates in Ukrainian history. They were intuitive to me. I don't feel like I had to do a lot of research to make sense of them. I could basically cite very quickly, weave together the story. What was difficult for me was disciplining myself in terms of how much of that story to tell. And that was challenging, I would say. Paring down, you could spend the whole book like relaying different elements of Ukrainian history, and I couldn't do that. I really probably am able to devote only about a quarter of the book to really exploring the history of Ukraine, or a third of the book. And so the discipline was tricky, but you know, I figured it out pretty quickly.
Okay, Nicholas, you had a question? Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Thank you so much. Honestly, I haven't read the book, but thanks for first. But when you were like deciding like how to organize, like how did you decide how to organize it? So I noticed that it's like kind of seasons, like according to it from the war starts and the sports. So like there's an interruption to the people's stories.
Yeah.
Like did you find that it flows better this way, that it tells their stories better as opposed to like if each chapter was just like named after the person?
Yeah, it's a great question. The organization for the book came very intuitively to me. As I interviewed these people over time for the first several months, it was clear to me that their lives were kind of organized by season, more or less. Especially that first winter of war when Russia was destroying the energy infrastructure and Ukrainians were so terrified of the cold. It was clear to me, and that first summer, the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and then the fall was the Kherson counteroffensive, and the first winter where they were, Russia was advancing so quickly, and then the Ukrainian army retook the Kyiv region. So much of this war has kind of been organized already naturally into season, and my subjects' lives kind of de facto were also organized into season, and so that felt natural to me. I knew that I wanted to weave their stories together because so much of the drama of these stories is seeing how they kind of how there's interplay between the different people, that they're experiencing such different things on different sides of Ukraine. And if you understand what different people are going through simultaneously, it's really powerful and really effective, I think. So I knew that I wanted to braid them together in that way. As the more that I was writing the book in the second year of war. So I had collected all of my material essentially already as I was writing. And so I could kind of put together a vision. I could kind of see the forest from the trees a little bit. I wasn't collecting a lot of material simultaneously while I wrote. I was still doing a little bit, trying to fill in holes and things like that. But my subjects really more or less told me the episodes in their lives that mattered to them. I would ask kind of open-ended questions about their experience in this or their experience in that, and they were able to kind of distill for me what mattered to them. And the biggest hurdle for me, honestly, there were so many things that were challenging about writing this book. The logistics of managing this quantity, the scale of material was really challenging. Keeping everything in a very organized timeline, photos, video, transcribing voice messages, transcribing videos, trying to just keep things as tight, as true to chronology as possible was a huge task. And once I was able to kind of manage the source material, I think things more or less fell in its place. But the other thing that was really challenging, kind of related to that, I'll end here, is not just managing the material that people were giving me, but managing 7 relationships with these. I mean, they were real relationships. They are real relationships. I still correspond with several of them. And I needed it, and they needed it to be a relationship built on trust, built on mutual understanding. And that was a lot of work. It involved a lot of a lot of correspondence, a lot of effort to keep those relationships functional, and not just functional, but places of trust.
Any other questions? Yeah, Daniel.
Hey there, so I was curious, I noticed that some of your interlocutors, one of them was from Chesapeake Yard or lived there. And I was curious about their sort of relationship or relationship of others around them with the Soviet past of that region. And more specifically, I would say the myth of Donbass, which is a sort of a myth that's been instrumentalized by pro-Russian actors and Russia itself. This idea of the bygone Soviet industrial powerhouse, which was in a sense wasted and leveled by Ukrainian independence. Of course, I'm not saying that's actually what happened, but that's how the myth at least goes. I was wondering what the relationship was with that myth, and just in general with perhaps other parts of Ukraine as well, because there's this idea of there be two Ukraines,
Yeah.
sort of Russophone, Russian, Western Ukrainophone, half of Ukraine. Because I noticed in one passage, I believe the persons of Western Ukrainian heritage or something to that effect, or at the very least they had sort of sympathetic feelings for Western. So I was curious. Sorry
Yeah.
for the lot.
No, it's a great question. And a really, really important question. I mean, it's fundamental to a lot of the dynamics that we're seeing in Ukraine today. And Yulia actually she was born in Chasiv Yar, and she and her husband Oleg moved to Konstantinovka, which is just right next to Chasiv Yar, and right next to Bakhmut, kind of this really, hot, bloody part of the war, as many of you know. And I talk quite a bit in the book about the collapse of the Soviet Union vis-a-vis Yulia's story, because the collapse of the Soviet Union meant different things to different people in Ukraine. It meant something different for people in Eastern Ukraine than it did to people in Western Ukraine or in Kyiv. It was so deeply traumatizing for Eastern Ukrainians whose industrial infrastructure was destroyed or left to rot, basically. And that's so fundamental for understanding political sympathies that persist certainly until 2014, but even until today. And you can't understand modern Ukraine unless you understand the contrasting experiences of the experience in the 1990s, really following the collapse of the Soviet Union in Western Ukraine, Kyiv, Eastern Ukraine. It's so fundamental to that people's psyche, I think. And I would say Yulia, Yulia is very kind of classic, a very classic Donbass woman, in the sense that she continues to speak Russian. She has given a lot to stay in Ukraine. Her son-in-law serves in the army on the front. Both of her children have pivoted to speaking exclusively Ukrainian, but this is a complex thing for many Ukrainians. And she has political opinions that I would say by and large mirror kind of moderate people in the Donbass. She's obviously anti-separatist, and she talked quite a bit about how difficult it was to see so many of the neighboring towns and so much of the infrastructure destroyed in 2014 to 2022, and watching people flee to Russia, even in 2022, and how challenging that was. But it was so important to me to have a character like Yulia in my book, because this is real Ukraine. It represents a huge portion of the population, and it was very interesting for me to correspond with her over the course of the war and watch how different people who were ardently anti-Russia, who were ardently pro-Ukraine, take very, very different approaches to the Ukrainian government and to ideological changes occurring domestically within Ukraine. It was really interesting to see.
Any other questions? No, yes, please,
Clear
Chris.
question, also thinking about the, I mean, I've got a lot of relations, I've been thinking about Vitaly and his relationship to the United States. And perhaps is it in the book, or to what extent is that a sort of a, just a sort of a playful expression of his, youthful inspiration or identity from the nineties, and to what extent is it a sense of there being a Western partner out there that is, looking out for people struggling for freedom, and if that is the case, and if you're still in touch,
Yeah,
what's his take on?
thank you. It's a really
things
good
that are-
question. Well, it's definitely, my sense is that it's definitely the latter. It's not a playful,
Sure.
It's not about fashion or pizza or whatever. This is, Vitaly and his whole generation, his whole cohort were attracted to this image, this ideal, even if it was fake, because it represented something so different than where they came from. This system that their parents and grandparents had suffered fear and repression and hunger for so long, and it offered an alternative that seemed to be extremely functional and extremely attractive. And I think for Vitaly and others like him, millions like him, this was something that he clung to as, an ideal that gave him hope for his society, his town, his life. I think that's what the coffee shop means to him, right? Is we can live differently. We can interact with the world differently. It doesn't have to be this way. And I think that's what it meant to him. I am still in touch with Vitaly, and I messaged him actually a couple of days, or the day of, or the day after the very sorry, shameful scene in the Oval Office with Zelensky and Vance and Trump, and told him how ashamed I was and how sorry I was and what he thought about it. And he said something to the effect of, if America chooses to give up Ukraine, they will no longer be a leader. And I said, and if we do, he said, then we will fight without America. And this meant something much more than just those words, coming from Vitaly. That this was, Vitaly realizing that Ukraine has something to give beyond America, that perhaps Ukraine has something to give to the world that America refuses to or won't, or
Thank you. Any more questions? No, if there are no more questions. Maybe I'll finish with kind of a summing up. Since the full-scale invasion, even before, but certainly more since, there's been various attempts at filling this gap, this lack of knowledge about Ukraine, of course. And it's obviously the last 3 years, the world's been listening more than before, right? So I think it's important. I think you've done an admirable job of giving a voice to Ukraine. That's another gap that needs to be filled. You've given us 7 voices here, which is also very important. And I think it's very important that this is being done 3 years into when people are really not listening as much.
Yeah.
So it's important that this keeps going in new formats, and hopefully this will lead to solidarity and for people to keep listening. So what would you hope? You're saying that filling the gap, what will that change if you fill that gap?
I suppose I hope that Americans who read this book come away really feeling like what separates us from Ukrainians is actually nothing.
Mhm.
That we are, made of the same stuff. That just because they find themselves in war and we do not, means nothing about us and nothing about them. And engenders in Americans a more humane sense of solidarity and sympathy, and understanding that Ukrainians are giving us a gift right now that we would be so foolish to disregard.
Well, thank you. Hopefully that you'll be, and I think your book will be great in addressing that need. So thanks again for coming to Harriman. Thank you, everybody.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming.
Good luck with your subsequent presentations.
Thank you.